Some doors are locked to keep danger out. Others stay locked because grief has already moved in. On one freezing evening, a woman reached for her front door knowing that whoever stood outside could change the rest of her life. Yet what made her hand hesitate wasn't fear of the man waiting on the porch. It was the promise she had made to herself that no soldier would ever cross that threshold again. The stranger on the other side had no idea the house still held a pair of boots that would never be worn, a dinner plate that had not been moved in months, and a clock that had stopped at the exact hour everything fell apart. He only knew he needed to ask one simple question before night swallowed the road. What happened after that knock would leave an entire village questioning who their enemies really were. By the time the snow melted, neither of them would be the same. The wind carried dry snow across the empty road as evening settled over a quiet village in western Germany during the first bitter winter after the war. Most homes had repaired roofs patched together with mismatched boards, but many windows still wore cracks that no one had the money to replace. Smoke drifted slowly from a handful of chimneys, disappearing into a gray sky that seemed to hold the cold close to the earth. Anna Keller lived alone at the edge of the village in a modest stone cottage where silence had become more familiar than conversation. Every morning began the same way. She lit the stove, swept the floor, checked the small vegetable cellar, and wound a clock that stubbornly refused to keep time for more than a few hours. She never bothered fixing it. Some things, she believed, were meant to remain broken. The photograph on the mantel showed a younger woman standing beside a smiling man in a tailored jacket, both looking toward a future they believed belonged to them. Dust settled on the wooden frame faster than she could wipe it away. Outside, fresh footprints suddenly appeared on the untouched snow leading toward her front gate. They were not the boots of a neighbor. They were heavier, measured, disciplined. Anna noticed them through the kitchen window before she heard the knock. It came once. Calm. Respectful. Then silence. No pounding. No command. No demand to open the door. She stood motionless, one hand resting on the edge of the table, listening to nothing except the crackle of the stove and the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. A second knock followed, softer than the first, as though the stranger understood that whatever waited inside the house deserved patience. Anna remained where she was, her eyes fixed on the weathered oak door as if it had suddenly become the only thing holding her world together. She counted 3 slow breaths before stepping forward. The floorboards answered with familiar creaks beneath her wool slippers. Her hand stopped just above the iron latch. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, hearing memories instead of the wind. Then she lifted the latch and pulled the door open only a few inches. The man waiting outside immediately removed his gloves and stepped back 1 pace, careful to leave space between them. His khaki greatcoat carried a thin layer of snow across the shoulders, and his boots were dusted white from miles of frozen roads. He looked tired rather than threatening, his face weathered by long weeks outdoors, his blue eyes calm but alert. "Good evening, ma'am," he said quietly in careful German that carried a noticeable British accent. "My name is Lieutenant Thomas Bennett. I am sorry to disturb you." Anna answered nothing. She simply studied him. She had expected orders. She had expected questions delivered with authority. Instead, he stood with both hands visible, almost like a visitor asking permission rather than a soldier carrying responsibility. Thomas noticed the hesitation in her expression and lowered his voice even further. "A family from the next village said someone here might know whether an elderly carpenter named Otto Weiss still lives nearby. I have been searching since this morning." Anna continued watching him. Snowflakes gathered along the brim of his cap, while the cold air drifted into the narrow opening of the house. Finally she spoke. "He died last spring." Thomas looked down for only a second before nodding slowly. "Thank you for telling me." There was disappointment in his face, but not frustration. He reached into the leather satchel hanging from his shoulder and unfolded a worn notebook. He crossed out one name with the tip of a pencil that had almost been used to its end. Anna noticed how carefully he wrote, how deliberate every movement seemed. He thanked her again and turned as though prepared to continue walking into the fading light. Then the wind suddenly pushed harder across the open fields. His scarf slipped aside, revealing a deep crack in the skin of his neck left by the bitter cold rather than injury. His bare hands were red from hours outside, and despite the freezing air he pulled his gloves back on slowly, almost hiding how stiff his fingers had become. Something inside Anna shifted ever so slightly. Before she fully understood why, she heard herself speak again. "There is hot water on the stove." Thomas stopped without turning around. "If you wish," she added after another quiet pause, "you may warm your hands before you continue." Thomas remained still for a moment, almost uncertain he had heard her correctly. The wind continued to sweep across the empty road, carrying loose snow around his boots. He slowly turned back toward the doorway. "Thank you," he said simply. "Only for a minute." Anna stepped aside without another word. He entered carefully, wiping his boots on the coarse mat before crossing the threshold, leaving as little snow behind as possible. The small gesture did not escape her notice. The cottage was warm compared to the frozen evening outside, though warmth came more from the cast-iron stove than from comfort. Firelight flickered across stone walls, worn wooden shelves, and furniture that had clearly been repaired more than once. Nothing inside the house was unnecessary. Every object seemed to have survived because replacing it had never been an option. Thomas quietly removed his gloves and held his hands near the kettle resting on the stove. Thin lines marked his fingers where the cold had split the skin. Anna poured steaming water into a simple ceramic basin and placed it beside him without speaking. He looked at the basin, then at her. "You are very kind," she answered while arranging another piece of wood into the fire. "It is only hot water." Silence settled naturally between them. It was not uncomfortable. The only sounds came from the gentle bubbling of the kettle and the occasional crack from burning oak. Thomas allowed the warmth to return to his hands slowly instead of rushing them closer to the fire. He seemed to understand that sudden heat could hurt as much as the cold. Anna noticed the habit with quiet curiosity. This was not the behavior of a man careless with small things. Her eyes drifted toward the leather satchel resting against his chair. Maps, notebooks, neatly folded papers. No unnecessary clutter. Everything organized with quiet discipline. Thomas followed her glance and offered a faint smile. Too many roads. Too many names. Anna looked back at the stove. And too many empty houses. He did not answer immediately because there was nothing honest he could say to change those words. Instead, his attention wandered to the front window where the loose wooden shutter moved slightly each time the wind pressed against it. The lower hinge had nearly pulled free from the frame. Each gust made the wood scrape softly against the stone wall. Thomas stood, walked to the window, and gently tested the hinge with 2 fingers. "This will not survive another hard storm," he said quietly. Anna shrugged without looking up. "It has held this long." Thomas examined the loose screws before reaching into his coat pocket. From a small cloth roll, he removed a compact screwdriver, the sort carried by someone used to fixing whatever could not be replaced. "If you do not mind," he said, "I believe I can give it another winter." Anna watched without answering. Thomas knelt beside the window and loosened the damaged hinge with slow, deliberate movements, careful not to split the old wood. He turned each screw into his palm instead of letting it fall onto the floor. Years of habit showed in every motion. The shutter had warped from seasons of rain and frost, but after adjusting the hinge and tightening the frame, he opened and closed it twice. The scraping sound disappeared. Only the wind remained outside. He stepped back and nodded once, almost to himself. "It should hold now," he said. Anna walked to the window and rested her fingertips against the frame. For the first time in months, it closed without resistance. She looked toward him but found no trace of expectation on his face. He was already rolling the small screwdriver back into its cloth wrap. "You carry tools everywhere?" she asked quietly. A faint smile crossed his face. "My father repaired watches in Sussex. He used to say that if something can be mended in 10 minutes, it deserves those 10 minutes. Anna glanced toward the silent clock on the mantel. Thomas followed her eyes. The clock stood beneath the faded wedding photograph, its brass pendulum perfectly still. Dust had settled along its carved edges, untouched except for a narrow line where someone had once tried to wipe it clean. "May I?" he asked, pointing toward it. Anna hesitated longer than before. "It has not worked in nearly 2 years. Sometimes that only means nobody has listened to it closely enough." She carried the clock to the kitchen table and placed it before him with both hands, almost as though returning something fragile to life. Thomas opened the small wooden case with remarkable care. He did not force a single piece. He simply observed. His fingers moved lightly over the gears while his eyes searched for what the mechanism was trying to tell him. After a quiet minute, he lifted a tiny fragment of rust from one of the wheels and placed it beside the clock. "Not broken," he whispered. "Only stuck." Anna remained standing across the table, watching his concentration. The room felt strangely different. No longer occupied by a widow and a foreign soldier, but by two strangers sharing the simple work of restoring ordinary things. Thomas adjusted one spring, turned the winding key gently, then released the pendulum. For a second, nothing happened. Then the brass weight moved once, twice. A steady ticking filled the room, soft enough to disappear beneath the crackling stove, yet impossible to ignore. Anna instinctively looked toward the photograph above the mantel before lowering her eyes again. Neither of them spoke. Some sounds did not need explanation. Thomas quietly closed the clock case and slid it back across the table. "There," he said. "Time has decided to move again." Thomas slipped the screwdriver back into his satchel and fastened the worn leather strap. He accepted no payment, asked for no favor, and offered no speech about kindness. He simply thanked Anna for the warm water, put on his gloves, and stepped back into the winter evening. The door closed gently behind him. The ticking clock continued its patient rhythm, each second filling a silence that had once seemed permanent. Anna stood beside the table for several minutes without moving. Finally, she lifted the clock from the kitchen table and returned it to the mantel beneath the photograph. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the hands were moving forward. Outside, Thomas disappeared into the falling snow until even his footprints faded beneath the wind. The following morning began like every other. Gray skies, thin frost covering the garden fence, smoke rising slowly from scattered chimneys across the village. Anna carried a small bucket to the well behind her cottage and noticed something unusual. The front gate, which had sagged crooked for months, rested perfectly against its post. She frowned, walked closer, and saw a fresh wooden wedge securing the lower hinge. Someone had repaired it before sunrise. There was no note, no signature, only careful workmanship. She looked toward the road. It was empty except for a fresh set of boot prints leading away from the house. 2 days later, she heard familiar footsteps again. Thomas was walking the same patrol route, accompanied by another British soldier several yards behind him. As they approached the cottage, Thomas acknowledged her with nothing more than a polite nod. He did not stop. He did not wave. He simply continued along the road as though respecting an invisible boundary that neither of them wished to disturb. Anna found herself watching until both men disappeared beyond the frozen trees. The pattern quietly repeated itself over the following weeks. Sometimes he passed during the morning, sometimes near sunset. Occasionally, he paused only long enough to ask whether everything was well before continuing on his way. Once he carried a small sack of coal assigned to isolated homes with limited supplies. Another afternoon, he helped an elderly widow farther down the road lift a broken cartwheel without making any announcement of it. The villagers noticed. They always noticed. Conversations grew quieter whenever British uniforms appeared. Curtains moved slightly as people watched from their windows. One evening, while Anna purchased flour at the village bakery, 2 women lowered their voices as she entered. They stopped speaking altogether when she reached the counter. No accusation was spoken aloud. None was necessary. Silence could carry suspicion just as easily as words. Anna paid for her flour, thanked the baker, and walked home beneath the fading winter light. As she reached her cottage, she noticed a small bundle of split firewood stacked neatly beside the back door. There were no footprints left to identify who had placed it there because fresh snow had already covered the ground. By February, the hardest edge of winter had begun to soften, although the mornings still arrived wrapped in frost. The fields beyond the village remained pale beneath thin sheets of ice, and every breath lingered in the air before disappearing into the quiet. Anna had settled into a routine she never admitted to herself. Whenever she heard measured footsteps on the road, she found some reason to glance through the kitchen window. Sometimes Thomas passed without looking toward the cottage. Sometimes he tipped his cap ever so slightly before continuing along the lane. Neither of them tried to turn these brief encounters into conversation. They simply became part of the rhythm of ordinary days, as natural as the ticking clock on the mantel. One afternoon, Thomas stopped outside the gate carrying a folded piece of paper. "The district office updated the list of food deliveries," he explained. "I thought you should know your village will receive flour next Tuesday instead of Friday." Anna accepted the paper with a quiet thank you. Before he turned to leave, she noticed the corner of an envelope protruding from his satchel. The paper had softened from being opened many times. A familiar habit recognized another. "A letter from home?" she asked. Thomas smiled faintly without removing it. "From my mother. She writes every Sunday whether I answer or not." There was warmth in his voice, but also distance. "Does she worry?" Anna asked. "She worries professionally," he replied with gentle humor. "She believes every cold becomes pneumonia, and every delayed letter means disaster." Anna surprised herself with the smallest smile. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came, but Thomas noticed it nonetheless. His hand rested briefly on the satchel before he spoke again. "She still sets an extra place at Christmas." The words were simple. Their meaning was not. Anna lowered her eyes toward the snow gathered along the fence. "For your father?" Thomas nodded once. "For my younger brother, Daniel." The wind carried several quiet seconds between them. He never came home from Normandy. He did not describe the battle. He did not need to. Anna looked toward the front window where the wedding photograph stood above the now faithful clock. "My husband left in the spring of 1944, she said softly. The last letter arrived 6 months later. After that, only silence. Neither asked which side had suffered more. Neither tried to measure grief against grief. They simply stood on opposite sides of a weathered gate, discovering that loss spoke the same language in every country. A rook crossed the gray afternoon sky overhead, its wings cutting through the stillness before disappearing beyond the bare trees. Thomas adjusted the strap of his satchel and looked at Anna with quiet understanding. "War took different roads," he said, "but it knocked on both our doors." Anna did not answer immediately. She simply nodded once, and for the first time since that winter evening when a stranger had knocked upon her cottage, the distance between them felt smaller than the gate that separated them. The conversation at the gate lingered in Anna's thoughts long after Thomas had continued down the road. His footsteps disappeared into the distance, but his final words remained in the quiet rooms of the cottage like the steady ticking of the restored clock. As February gave way to early March, winter slowly loosened its grip. Snow retreated from the fields in uneven patches, revealing dark earth beneath, while narrow streams carried melted ice toward the river beyond the village. Life began returning in small, almost invisible ways. Chickens wandered into farmyards again. Smoke rose earlier from kitchen chimneys. Children who had spent months indoors cautiously returned to the lanes. Yet not every change welcomed hope. One afternoon, Anna walked to the village square carrying a basket with fresh bread and 2 jars of preserved beets. Conversation stopped as she approached the market stalls. No one greeted her. An elderly man who had once exchanged friendly smiles now busied himself arranging potatoes he had already arranged twice. 2 younger women looked toward the road where British patrols often passed before quietly turning away from Anna without a word. The silence weighed more than open criticism ever could. As she started home, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. It was Marta, the baker's daughter, nearly out of breath. "Anna," she whispered, carefully avoiding eye contact with the others nearby. "Some people have been talking." Anna answered calmly. "People always talk." Marta hesitated before continuing. "They say the British officer visits your house too often. They say you are forgetting whose side you belong to." Anna adjusted the basket in her hands. "I belong to no side anymore," she replied softly. "I belong to this village, to this house, and to the memories I cannot leave behind." Marta looked relieved to hear the answer, yet fear remained in her expression. "Be careful," she said before quickly walking away. The following morning Thomas arrived during his usual patrol and immediately sensed something had changed. Anna's smile, already rare, had disappeared entirely. She thanked him for delivering the district notices, but kept the conversation brief. Before leaving, Thomas noticed several fresh scratches carved into one of the fence posts beside her gate. The words had been roughly scraped away with a knife before he arrived, leaving only damaged wood and splinters behind. He studied the marks for a moment without asking who had done it. Anna followed his gaze. "Wood heals more easily than people," she said quietly. Thomas reached down and brushed loose splinters from the post with the palm of his glove. "Perhaps," he answered, "but neither should be left neglected." He looked toward the village, where curtains shifted behind windows and distant figures paused to watch from across the road. He understood then that the greatest burden Anna carried was no longer the memory of war. It was the suspicion of peace. March arrived with longer afternoons and softer lights stretching across the fields. The last patches of snow disappeared beneath steady rain, leaving the earth dark and ready for another season. The village slowly returned to its routines, yet the quiet distance surrounding Anna never fully disappeared. People still watched before they greeted her. Some never greeted her at all. She learned to accept the silence without allowing it to harden her heart. One cool morning, Thomas walked toward the cottage carrying a folded envelope instead of his usual notebook. His pace was slower than usual. Even before he spoke, Anna sensed something had changed. He removed his cap and held the envelope between both hands. "I received new orders," he said gently. "My unit returns to England in 3 days." The words settled between them as naturally as falling leaves, quiet but impossible to ignore. Anna looked toward the garden where tiny green shoots had begun pushing through the damp soil. Winter had finally surrendered, yet another farewell had quietly arrived. 3 days, she repeated, almost to herself. Thomas nodded. "Another officer will take over this district." Neither of them reached for words large enough to explain what those months had become. Their friendship had never depended upon promises. It had grown from ordinary moments, repaired shutters, shared silence, a clock brought back to life, and two people who had learned that grief recognized no uniform. On his final patrol through the village, Thomas stopped only briefly at Anna's gate. He thanked her for every cup of warm water, every conversation, every quiet kindness that had reminded him the work of rebuilding nations always began with rebuilding trust. Anna disappeared into the cottage for only a moment before returning with a carefully folded wool scarf. The yarn was simple, gray with a narrow blue stripe running along each edge. "I finished it last night," she said. "The weather across the channel is colder than people admit." Thomas accepted the scarf with both hands, as though receiving something far more valuable than wool. "I will wear it," he replied. "Not because it is warm, but because I will remember who made it." He smiled, and for the first time since they had met, the weariness seemed to leave his face completely. The next morning, before sunrise, Anna opened her front door and found no footprints waiting on the damp ground. Instead, resting neatly beside the repaired gate was a small cloth bundle. Inside lay several packets of vegetable seeds, each labeled carefully in English and German, along with the tiny winding key that belonged to the old mantel clock. Beneath them rested a single handwritten note. It contained only 2 words: "For spring." Anna held the note quietly against her hands while the first rays of morning touched the garden, and somewhere inside the cottage the faithful clock continued counting each new second toward a future neither of them would see together. 20 years passed with the quiet certainty of the old clock that never stopped again. Seasons came and went across the little cottage at the edge of the village. Spring returned faithfully with green shoots rising from the garden where Anna had planted every packet of seeds exactly as they had been given to her. Summer filled the yard with vegetables and wildflowers. Autumn covered the stone path with golden leaves. Winter always came back, but it never felt quite as lonely as it once had. The repaired shutter remained secure through every storm. The garden gate continued to open without a sound. The clock marked birthdays, harvests, lonely evenings, and peaceful mornings with the same steady rhythm that had begun on a cold winter night years before. The gray scarf had never returned, and Anna never expected it to. Some gifts were never meant to come home because they had already found their place. One bright afternoon in the spring of 1966, a modest motorcar stopped outside the cottage. The engine fell silent, and a young man, perhaps 25 years old, stepped onto the familiar stone path. He carried no uniform, only a small leather satchel worn smooth with use. He paused at the gate, gently touched the weathered wood, and smiled as though recognizing something from an old family photograph. Anna, now older with silver beginning to replace the color in her hair, opened the front door before he had the chance to knock. The young man removed his cap politely. "Mrs. Keller?" he asked. She nodded. "My name is Edward Bennett." The name rested quietly in the spring air. "Lieutenant Thomas Bennett was my father." Anna stood perfectly still. The garden seemed to fall silent with her. Edward reached into his satchel and carefully removed a folded gray wool scarf. Though softened by years of careful use, the narrow blue stripes remained visible along the edges. My father wore this every winter until the day he passed away, Edward said. He always told us it was made by the bravest woman he ever met. Not because she faced soldiers, but because she chose kindness after losing everything. Anna accepted the scarf with both hands, feeling the familiar texture beneath her fingertips. Neither of them spoke for several moments. There was nothing left that required explanation. The clock inside the cottage continued its patient ticking while a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the open doorway. Edward looked toward the flourishing garden and smiled. He said you would still be growing spring. Anna looked across the flowers dancing beneath the afternoon sun, then toward the open gate where a stranger had once stood asking only for permission to enter. A lifetime earlier she had believed she was opening her door to the memory of war. Instead, she had quietly opened it to the possibility that dignity could survive hatred, that ordinary kindness could outlive history, and that the quietest people often changed the world without ever raising their voices.